Hello there my friends, and welcome back to our series where we discuss and review various Warhammer books out of Fantasy and 40k. I would say Age of Sigmar too, but unfortunately I've only ever read a few of those, at least up to this point. Although, tiny segue, if you've ever wanted to read a good horror story and check out something from Age of Sigmar, I do recommend the novel Dark Harvest. I am your host, the GrimDark narrator, and today I wanted to talk to you about a pretty famous and iconic book of Warhammer Fantasy. Or maybe I should say iconic trilogy, because I do think a lot of people are familiar with this story, but in a way that as it is part of its trilogy, as opposed to just the individual books. I am talking, of course, about the Von Carstein Trilogy, with today being dedicated to the first volume called Inheritance. This is quite an old book and trilogy, and we're gonna find out if it's still worth reading today, or if it was any good to begin with, right? But before we begin any of that, I'd just like to take a moment and request that if you enjoy this type of content, and would also like to visit, or rather revisit, all my old and upcoming story content and narrations from the old YouTube channel, please consider checking out my Patreon page. And the Rumble channel if you missed the old lore videos. I keep saying this, but every now and then there's a person who asks me, where did I disappear, where did my old channel go, and what happened to my narrations. So I'll keep doing this as long as I do these videos. Checking out all those is free, and it is also my main source of income right now, so you can decide for yourselves if anything there is worth supporting me. Thanks a lot, and now back to today's topic. So, the Von Carstein Trilogy, and Inheritance in particular. Like I said, these are some pretty old books, with Inheritance being published all the way back in 2006. So it's literally 2 decades old. Older than some Warhammer fans out there, even, I'd say. All 3 were written by Stephen Saville, and I think he did a good job with some aspects of the theme and the characters, and maybe not that great a job on some other stuff. Still, if nothing else, these books might very well be the books to read from Warhammer literature if you're a big fan of vampires. Now, mind you, these are not the only vampire books in the Warhammer universe. There's still quite a few others, and some of them I'd say are actually better than these. There is the caveat though that most of these books are considerably newer, like the Ulrika Trilogy, or Neferata, or the Red Duke, and there are a few others. In some regards, I would say that Von Carstein even paved the way for those, even though there are also other vampire books which are just as old, such as the Vampire Genevieve trilogy. But we're obviously not here to talk about those or make a tier list. We're here so you could hear me rant for 20 minutes or so about a vampire book. And that book is Inheritance. From the start, I'd like to disclose that I do have a pretty strong connection to this novel, regardless of how good or bad it might actually be considered objectively. This is also one of the first Warhammer Fantasy novels I've ever read. It also had the dubious honor of being the first Warhammer Fantasy story I've ever narrated as a hobby. You can actually find it on my Patreon. I don't really remember if I read this before or after I started Gothic and Felix, but I do remember being very excited about finally getting to read some Warhammer Fantasy novels at the time. And this one had vampires. And vampires are almost always cool, right? And the main antagonist is clearly inspired from my own country's Dracula stories. You know, like Vlad Țepeș or Vlad Dracul. I mean, the guy in the story is Vlad Von Carstein. But anyway, my point is, I have very fond memories of this series, and of this book in particular, but the series overall as well. Even though back when I narrated these, I realized that maybe it wasn't as good as I first thought. But what is Inheritance and the wider trilogy about? I did say earlier that these might be the vampire books to read set in this universe, and I do stand by that statement. These books deal with a period known as the Vampire Wars in the history of the old world, and most particularly the Empire. Curiously, it is actually not set in the quote-unquote present day of Warhammer, with Emperor Karl Franz, but a few hundred years prior. The stories concern the von Carstein vampire dynasty, led in the beginning by none other than Vlad von Carstein, and their attempts to basically conquer or destroy the empire, depending on the ruling count, and why not the entire world of the living. And these vampire wars, there were 3 of them, were basically the attempts of 3 different vampire lords and their minions to, do some bad things to the world, and particularly to the empire. Worth noting though is that Vlad actually wanted to rule the empire, not just to kill and eat everyone. And the story of Vlad and campaign is actually what forms the bulk of the first book, Inheritance. Now, Vlad is far from the only character in these books. In fact, I'd say that one of the negatives of these stories is that there might even be too many perspectives and characters. I think Inheritance was the least guilty of this, if I recall correctly. But one way or another, there are many POVs from multiple sides of the conflict. Now, as far as themes and atmosphere goes, at least for parts of this book, the author did manage to convey Gothic horror really well, in my opinion. In fact, I don't think anyone would disagree that the beginning of this, which we're gonna detail a bit more in the synopsis, is actually one of the strongest points of the book. Bram Stoker would definitely be proud. If I were to add anything myself here, is that Inheritance does make vampires scary and very, very powerful, as they should be in a good fantasy setting. Keep in mind that this book and the whole series were more or less contemporaries to the infamous Twilight movies. And unless you're like an emo teenage girl, the difference between these, or rather those sparkly dandies, and Warhammer vampires is night and day, no pun intended. The Warhammer vampires are master swordsmen. They can change into giant wolves or monster bats or mist or some other things. They can raise legions of the undead, they have their own dark magic, and they can break in half even the strongest warrior with just a flick of the wrist. These are the vampires of Bram Stoker to some degree, but way more over the top. Because beyond all these ridiculous abilities, they're also, charming, manipulative, just like the classical Dracula, which Vlad von Carstein is definitely based on. Now, for the narrative of this book, it is basically Vlad ascending to power in Sylvania, solidifying his rule there and basically turning the province into a kingdom of darkness. However, an interesting aspect of this is that the population of the province was more or less left alive. When you think about Sylvania in this trilogy, it is not actually just a region populated by nothing but skeletons and bats. There are actual people there. Of course, they batten down the proverbial hatches every night. Heck, there's a Sylvanian human militia fighting in Vlad's armies as well. Now, after Vlad cements his power, he basically starts a campaign against the Empire with the sole purpose of becoming Emperor himself. And earlier I mentioned that the book doesn't hold up that well at a second read after a long time. That's because, as atmospheric and Gothic horror-ish the book is in the beginning, you don't really see or learn much more about Vlad throughout the story. In the beginning, he is presented as a main character and obviously the antagonist, but there are multiple perspectives in the book which kinda detract from his POV. There's also a switch in the second half of the book, as the story turns into more of a military-style campaign story, rather than a moody, somber Gothic tale. What I mean by that is that the first half of the book is juicy, while the second half is kinda dry. Most of the characters are not that well developed, barring like 2 or 3, and most of them do feel kinda two-dimensional. Not all of them, mind you, but this trilogy also has a kind of a bad habit of introducing some characters, making you think they're important and maybe even care about them, and then giving them kind of an meh end. And speaking of characters, as I said already, there are definitely more perspectives than just Vlad. There are other vampires, of course, but there's also some witch hunters, in this book particularly John Skellen and Stefan Fischer. In fact, in the beginning, the sections focusing on these two are some of the highlights, because it is very atmospheric with them in the wilderness hunting for vampires, and unfortunately finding them. There is also a Knight of the White Wolf, with a very tragic story, as he defeats Vlad one time, but of course that doesn't stick, and he ends up as a vampire instead. But curiously, one that still sticks to the honor and moral code and the chivalry and goodness afterwards. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Isabella von Carstein, the love story of whom with Vlad is quite legendary. There's quite a few large-scale undead battles and siege sequences in this book. Heck, we get to siege Altdorf itself. Vlad von Carstein, as mentioned earlier, is often portrayed as a charismatic and imposing figure, embodying both aristocratic sophistication and feral monstrosity. All that said, would I recommend Inheritance? The answer is yes, but with a however attached. I'd say that the whole book is carried by the Gothic atmosphere, the dread and the despair, which is quite well portrayed when it comes to show vampires as the sophisticated monsters that they are. But the shift from Gothic horror to war story, the multiple shifting perspectives, the abrupt cutoffs right when, quote-unquote, it gets good, the very rapid pace of the story in the second half, all these kinda drag the score down. That is my opinion at any rate. If it makes any difference, despite thinking that Vlad is the best vampire in the trilogy, I actually enjoyed the second volume, Dominion, a bit more. Because that one feels like a tragedy portrayed on a theater stage, with the story of the mad vampire Conrad. For the last part of the video, we're gonna do a synopsis as we've been doing for quite a while now. For those of you who maybe don't have the book or ebook, or don't have the time to invest in it, or who might simply just want to know the story in 10 minutes or less. So, once upon a time, our story opens up in the plague-ridden province of Sylvania, under the tyrannical rule of one Count Otto von Drac. This guy was not a vampire, mind you. As Otto lies dying with no male heir one night, his abusive brothers prepare to seize power. But on the proverbial dark and stormy night, a mysterious stranger arrives at Castle Drakenhof. Offering his services to protect the realm, Vlad is married then to Otto's daughter, Isabella. Vlad quickly establishes firm control. He purges the corrupt and abusive local barons, replacing them with loyalists and dark minions. Under his early reign, Sylvania actually prospers a bit compared to what it was before, and especially compared to the Empire, which at the time is consumed by the Age of the Three Emperors, basically a very long and very complicated civil war. Unfortunately, for the population of Sylvania, they do begin to notice some disturbing changes. Taxes are now collected in livestock and blood, borders are closed, and death seems to lose its permanence. When Isabella contracts a fatal wasting disease, Vlad turns her too into a vampire, sealing their eternal bond. For decades afterwards, Vlad bides his time, turning nobility and gathering dark magical powers. On the infamous Geheimnisnacht, the night of the dark moon, aka Halloween, Vlad casts a massive spell across Sylvania known as the Knights' Alliance. Every corpse in the province graveyard rises from the earth and Vlad officially reveals his vampire nature to the world. He then goes into the First Vampire War, marching a vast army of zombies, skeletons, and monstrous horrors into the heartland of the Empire. The Empire's provinces, distracted by their own civil war, are entirely unprepared. Vlad also creates new lieutenants to lead his army, including Fritz, Peter, Konrad, and later the knight Jerek Kruger. During a fierce engagement in Middenheim, Jerek Kruger, a knight of the Knights of the White Wolf, does manage to cut Vlad down in single combat. The Empire celebrates, of course prematurely, assuming that the threat is done. But then Vlad appeared a year later completely unharmed, thanks to the magical power of the von Carstein ring. You see, this ring, as long as it was on the guy's finger obviously, actually brought him back from the dead, almost regardless of the damage suffered, even if you cut off his head. Vlad then tracks down Kruger, defeats him on a temple spire, and turns him into a vampire as punishment. But as we mentioned a bit earlier, Kruger does retain his moral code and repents, swearing to destroy Vlad's legacy from within. Now, as Vlad's legions once again sweep across the Empire, laying waste to cities like Nuln, internal betrayal begins to brew. Manfred von Carstein, desiring the crown of Sylvania for himself, realizes that he cannot defeat Vlad in open battle, and he anonymously passes critical information to Grand Theogonist Wilhelm III in Altdorf, revealing the secret behind Vlad's immortality, the one von Carstein ring. Meanwhile, we also have kind of a separate narrative with two witch hunters, John Skellen and Stefan Fischer, who hunt down the undead across the ravaged empire in Sylvania. And John Skellen, a very dark and tragic character, eventually gets turned into a vampire too. Towards the end of the book, Vlad's horde finally arrives at the walls of Altdorf, the imperial capital. Knowing that the standard military tactics will fail against an immortal commander, the Grand Theogonist releases the master thief Felix Mann out of prison. And under the cover of night, this Felix guy pulls off the greatest heist of all. He goes into Vlad's command tent and essentially slips the ring off his finger in secret. When Vlad does the traditional coffin awakening and discovers that the ring is missing, he goes into an uncontrollable rage. He abandons all tactical caution and orders a massive all-out assault against the city. During this battle, Vlad manages to corner Grand Theogonist Wilhelm III, and with his last ounce of strength, Wilhelm grabs the vampire count and hurls them both off the battlement. They plunge into the moat below, and Vlad gets impaled in a bed of sharpened wooden stakes. Trapped beneath the holy man's corpse and lacking the resurrection ring, Vlad von Carstein dies permanently. Or, at least until Nagash brings him back in the end times. Upon sensing her husband's real death, Isabella falls into despair, and eventually she kills herself. Without Vlad's magical powers to sustain the horde of the undead, the skeletons collapse into lifeless piles of dust. Finally, in the aftermath of all this, the thief, Felix Mann, attempts to flee, but is then ambushed in an alleyway by none other than Manfred. Manfred cuts off the thief's hands and reclaims the von Carstein ring for himself, and then slipping back into the shadows, setting the stage for the second volume, where we're gonna see the madness of Konrad, who is a much more brutal and unstable vampire lord than Vlad. And that, my friends, has been the summary of von Carstein Volume 1 Inheritance. If you enjoyed this, please consider leaving a like, share, subscribe, and comment. I always did enjoy reading your thoughts on any of the topics we discuss here. Have you ever read this book or trilogy? Did you enjoy it, or did you hate it? Why or why not? Do share your thoughts down below. Thanks a lot for watching to the end, and I wish you all a great and healthy day. Sigmar's blessings be upon you.